every single day, right? You open your phone, you turn on the TV, and bam, you're just hit with this wall of information. News alerts, market updates, global headlines, and we're all just scrolling, trying to make sense of it all. But have you ever just stopped for a second and wondered if the world you see in those headlines is, well, the same world you're actually living in? That's exactly what we're going to dig into. So take a look at this. This is pretty much your standard news day, right? We're talking big economic reports, huge company buyouts, international trade deals. It's a world of massive numbers and high-stakes decisions. But someone looked at this exact same flood of information and just felt that a huge piece of the story was missing. And this is where things get really interesting. It all starts with that simple but powerful thought. Hang on a second. It's that little voice in your head that decides to look past the breaking news banner and start asking its own questions. Okay, first up, the daily download. Let's break down what we're all seeing every day. You know the drill. The news cycle is just constantly churning out these massive, top-level stories. We hear about GDP numbers, big trade agreements between countries, and of course, the roller coaster of the stock market. These are always presented as the main events, the things that are really shaping our world. So now for section 2 of viewers' questions. This is where we get to the real heart of it, the stuff we start to wonder about. And here's the pivot. What happens when someone actually stops scrolling for a second, looks at all that information, and asks a really basic question? Does any of this actually reflect what's happening in my life? And that brings us to our first really big disconnect, what we're calling the deal on the deal. This is all about the gap between what's announced and what's actually real. So the headlines were everywhere. You couldn't miss them. A huge trade deal had been reached between the US and the EU. They were selling it as this major breakthrough, a problem solved. But then someone decided to go looking for the fine print, which led to a question that's just so simple, but so powerful. Okay, if this deal was made, where is it? Where's the signed piece of paper, the actual legal document that makes it a real thing? The answer? It just wasn't there. And look, this question, it cuts right to the heart of what journalism is supposed to be, right? This isn't just about a trade deal anymore. It's about the entire process of reporting. It's a real challenge, asking why something is being reported as a sure thing without any hard proof. So that same person with that same critical eye started noticing something else. And that brings us to our next section, headlines versus household bills. This is where two very different realities really start to clash. I mean, this says it all, doesn't it? On one side, you've got the world of the news. The economy's growing, there's talk about tariffs, stock futures are up. And then on the other side, you have the world people are actually living in, the things that are really on their minds. And the two, they just don't seem to line up. And listen, these aren't just vague feelings. For millions of people, the biggest story isn't some abstract economic number. No, it's the rent that's shooting through the roof. It's the crazy high price of just putting food on the table. It's having to deal with what were described as inhumane and insane requirements just to get by. These are the real everyday struggles. So, if the news wasn't digging into these kitchen table issues, what was it talking about? What story was so important it bumped all of this other stuff off the front page? Yup, jeans. In the middle of all these really urgent real-world economic worries, the news was focused on jeans. The difference is so jarring, it's almost funny. And it perfectly captures that feeling that priorities are, well, a little mixed up. Okay, so what are we supposed to make of all this? That brings us to our final section. What grabs our attention? What we've really been exploring here is this deep, fundamental tension, right? It's the gap between the world we see in the headlines and the world we actually experience. Between a deal that's announced and a deal that's signed. Between a story about tariffs and the actual price of your groceries. And this all really boils down to this one core idea in media called news value. See, every single day, newsrooms have to decide what's a big story and what's not. They use criteria like impact and prominence. But the critique we've been looking at here is a challenge to that very idea. Is the focus on the right kind of impact? the right kind of prominence. And that leaves us with one last thought. A question for you, really. This whole thing started because one person just looked at the news a little differently and started asking questions. So we'll leave you with one of your own. The next time you're scrolling through your feed, what are the big headlines you're seeing? And more importantly, what's the story you think is missing?